Whispers followed Gideon everywhere. Folks in Pinedale swore the mountain man was half grizzly, his face ruined by fire, his heart turned to stone by the high country freeze. They laughed when the telegraph arrived. No woman alive would travel 1,000 miles just to look at a monster, they said. Then the stagecoach rolled in through the November frost. A lone woman stepped out into the mud holding a worn carpet bag and a one-way ticket. She didn't flinch. Mud froze in jagged ruts along the main drag of Pinedale. It was the kind of cold that ached in the teeth. Gideon stood on the boardwalk outside the assayer's office, a massive silhouette wrapped in a buffalo coat. He kept his hat pulled low. The brim shadowed the left side of his face, the side where the skin looked like melted wax pulled tight over bone. He didn't want to be here. The town smelled of coal smoke, sour beer, and judging eyes. "Ah, stage is late," a voice rasped. It was Hiram, the livery owner, leaning against a post and spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. Reckon she turned around at Denver Gid. Can't say I blame her. A picture only tells half a story. The good half in your case. Gideon didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the road winding down from the pass. His hands, thick and calloused, rested deep in his coat pockets. "Stage is late because of the ice at Cutter's Ridge," Gideon said. His voice was a low, rough rumble, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. "Mind your business, Hiram." Hiram chuckled a wet, phlegmy sound, but stepped back. Nobody pushed Gideon too far. He was too big, too quiet, and too unpredictable in the eyes of the town. An hour later, the sharp crack of a whip echoed down the valley. The stagecoach lumbered into view, its wooden wheels caked in grey frost and mud. It rattled to a halt in front of the station, the horses blowing heavy white plumes of steam from their nostrils. Gideon's chest tightened. A heavy, suffocating knot of dread formed in his gut. He had paid her passage. He had written the letters. 3 letters painfully scrawled by candlelight offering nothing but a roof, regular meals, and a hard life in the mountains. He had been honest about his face. He had been honest about the isolation. He watched the stage door open. A salesman in a checkered suit stepped down first, swearing as his boot slipped in the mud. Then came a miner coughing into a rag. Finally, a woman appeared in the doorway. She didn't look like the fragile porcelain dolls in the catalogue advertisements. She was tall, wearing a heavy, dark wool coat that had seen better days. The hem was frayed. Her hat was practical, unadorned, pinned firmly to a mass of dark, unruly hair. She stepped down from the carriage with a stiff, practiced care, her boots hitting the frozen ground with a solid thud. She carried one worn carpet bag. That was it. A whole life packed into leather and canvas. Gideon stepped off the boardwalk. The mud crunched under his heavy boots. The town stopped what it was doing. The blacksmith paused his hammer. The women outside the mercantile turned their heads. They were all waiting for the scream. They were waiting for the horror to dawn on her face, for her to turn around and beg the driver to let her back inside. Jane stopped. She looked up. She saw him immediately. It wasn't hard. He was the largest man on the street, and the crowd had naturally parted to give him a wide berth. Her eyes a sharp, clear grey, locked onto his. Gideon stood completely still. He forced himself not to turn his head. He let her see him. The left side of his face was a ruin of puckered, shiny scars from a mine explosion 5 years gone. It pulled the corner of his left eye down slightly and dragged at his jaw. He knew what he looked like. A nightmare. A cautionary tale. Jane didn't gasp. She didn't drop her bag. She simply stared for a long, quiet moment, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Then she adjusted her grip on the carpet bag and walked straight toward him. "You're Gideon," she said. Her voice wasn't sweet. It was flat-tired and laced with the gravel of a 3-week journey across the country. "I am," he said. "I'm Jane." She looked past him toward the wagon hitched to the livery rail. "Is that your rig?" "It is." "Good. My feet are freezing, and I'd prefer not to stand in the street while the entire town watches us like a penny show." Gideon blinked. A slow, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. Surprise. He reached out and took the carpet bag from her hand. It was heavier than it looked. "Wagons this way." They walked in silence. He helped her up onto the wooden bench of the buckboard. She didn't hesitate to take his gloved hand, her grip firm. He untied the horses, climbed up beside her, and took the reins. "It's a 4-hour ride," Gideon warned, snapping the reins. The wagon lurched forward. "It's going to get colder. I've survived Boston winters in a room with a broken window and no coal," Jane said, staring straight ahead at the rutted road. "I'll manage." They left Pinedale behind, trading the stares and whispers for the silent, looming presence of the pine-covered mountains. The air grew thinner, sharper. Gideon kept waiting for her to ask questions. He waited for the nervous chatter he usually heard when people were forced into his company. It didn't come. Jane sat rigid, wrapped tight in her coat, enduring the bouncing wagon over the broken trail. After 2 hours, the snow began to fall. Fine, dry flakes whipped against their faces. Gideon reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He tossed it onto her lap without a word. "Thank you," she muttered, pulling it up to her chin. "Why'd you come?" The words were out before he could stop them. He hadn't meant to ask. Jane watched the snow dusting the tops of the pines. She didn't answer immediately. The creak of the wagon and the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves filled the silence. "The letters," she finally said. "You didn't promise me the moon. You didn't tell me I was beautiful, and you didn't say God had a grand plan for us. You said you had a cabin, a stove, and that you needed someone to keep the ledger and the hearth while you ran the trap lines." She turned her head, looking directly at his scarred profile. "I was tired of men making promises they couldn't keep. I figured a man who tells the ugly truth right up front is a man I can sleep under the same roof with." Gideon didn't say anything. He just tightened his grip on the reins and urged the horses faster up the mountain. The cabin sat in a clearing carved out of a dense stand of lodgepole pines. It wasn't a shack. It was a solid square structure of thick, notched logs, chinked tight with mud and moss. A stone chimney ran up the side, sending a thin, welcoming ribbon of grey smoke into the darkening winter sky. Gideon pulled the wagon round to the side and set the brake. He jumped down the snow, crunching under his weight, and walked around to Jane's side. She was shivering, her lips pale, but she didn't complain as he helped her down. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the brutal ride, and she stumbled slightly. He caught her elbow, steadying her. "Inside," he said, letting go quickly. Jane pushed open the heavy oak door. She stopped in the threshold. She had prepared herself for squalor. She had spent the last week of her journey steeling her nerves against the prospect of dirt floors, greasy pans, and the sour smell of a bachelor's neglect. Instead, the air smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and clean lye soap. The floor was rough-hewn planking, swept spotless. In the center of the room sat a black cast-iron stove, radiating a low, steady heat. To the left, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs. Against the far wall, a bed frame built into the logs piled high with thick quilts and a heavy bear pelt. It was stark. It was deeply lonely. But it was clean. Gideon came in behind her, carrying her carpet bag and a sack of flour from town. He set them by the door and moved immediately to the stove, throwing open the iron door and feeding 2 split logs into the glowing embers. The fire roared to life, casting flickering orange light across the room. "Take your coat off. Hang it by the fire," he ordered softly. Jane complied. Her fingers were clumsy with the cold, fumbling with the heavy buttons. When she finally shrugged out of the wool coat, she stood in a plain, dark grey dress. It was modest, practical, and hid the lines of her body. Gideon watched her for a fraction of a second before turning away. He walked to the washstand, poured water from a pitcher into a tin basin, and began to scrub his hands and face. Jane stood awkwardly by the stove, rubbing her hands together. The silence stretched between them thick and heavy. It wasn't a hostile silence, but it was profoundly uncomfortable. Two strangers, bound by a piece of paper signed in a distant courthouse, suddenly alone at the edge of the world. "I'll make coffee," Gideon said, wiping his face with a towel. The wetness made the shiny skin of his scars gleam dully in the lamplight. He didn't hide his face. He didn't turn away, he just went about his business. "I can do it," Jane said, stepping forward. "That's why I'm here, isn't it?" Gideon paused the tin coffee pot in his hand. He looked at her. "You've been travelling for weeks. Sit down." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Jane found herself obeying, pulling out one of the wooden chairs and sinking into it. She watched him move. For a massive man, he was surprisingly quiet on his feet. There was no wasted motion. He ground the beans, filled the pot, and set it on the hottest part of the stove. Then he pulled an iron skillet from a hook, dropped in a chunk of salt pork, and began slicing potatoes. Dinner was eaten in near total silence. The food was simple, heavy, and hot. Jane ate every bite. When the plates were cleared and washed, the reality of the night settled over the small room. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire popped. There was only one bed. Jane sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the grain of the wood. Her heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had known this part was coming. She had made peace with it in Boston. Survival required payment. She was a practical woman. Gideon stood by the stove, banking the coals for the night. He reached up and unbuckled his heavy leather gun belt, hanging it on a peg near the door. He took off his boots. "You take the bed," Gideon said, his back still turned to her. Jane looked up. "What?" "You heard me." Gideon walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it and pulled out 2 thick wool blankets and a rolled-up canvas tarp. He tossed them onto the floor near the hearth. "Mr. Croft." Jane started, her voice tight. "We are married. I understand my obligations." Gideon stopped. He turned slowly to face her. The firelight caught the ruined half of his face, casting deep, jagged shadows. His right eye, a piercing pale blue, fixed on her. "I didn't buy a whore, Jane," he said. His voice was rough, but there was no anger in it. Just a weary resignation. "I bought a partner. You're exhausted. You don't know me from a hole in the ground, and I sure as hell know you don't want to look at this." He gestured vaguely to his face. "Any closer than you have to right now." Jane felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Not because he was right, but because of the deep, self-loathing resignation in his tone. He expected her to be repulsed. He was protecting himself as much as he was protecting her. "It's not your face," Jane said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "It's late." Gideon cut her off, turning away. "Take the bed. I sleep better on the floor anyway. My back's bad." He didn't wait for her to argue. He laid out the tarp, wrapped himself in the blankets, and lay down with his back to the room. Jane sat at the table for a long time. She watched the steady rise and fall of his shoulders under the grey wool blanket. Finally she stood, blew out the oil lamp, and undressed in the dark. She climbed into the bed. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and dried grass. It was firm, smelling faintly of the forest. She pulled the heavy bear pelt over her shoulders. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, but inside it was warm. For the first time in 10 years, Jane closed her eyes and didn't feel terrified of the morning. Winter did not approach the mountain. It slammed into it. By the end of the first week, snow had drifted halfway up the cabin windows. The world outside became a blinding, freezing expanse of white. Inside the cabin, a delicate, unspoken routine formed. Gideon was up before the dawn. He would build the fire, put the coffee on, and slip out into the bitter cold to check his closest trap lines and tend the 2 mules in the lean-to. Jane would wake to the smell of coffee. She took over the cooking, the mending, and the endless task of keeping the cabin clean. It was hard, monotonous work, but it was peaceful. Nobody shouted, nobody demanded. They spoke very little. Their conversations were strictly transactional. We need more firewood. The flour is running low. The wind is shifting north. Yet, in the tight confines of the cabin, they were constantly aware of each other. Jane learned the rhythm of his limp, a slight hesitation on his left leg when the cold sank deep into his bones. Gideon learned that Jane drank her coffee black, that she hummed a tuneless melody when she scrubbed the cast-iron pots, and that she possessed an intense, unyielding stare when she was deep in thought. It happened on a Tuesday. Gideon had been gone since dawn. The sky, which had been a clear, brittle blue at sunrise, had rapidly turned the color of bruised iron by noon. The wind shifted, dropping the temperature so fast the logs of the cabin popped like rifle shots as the sap froze. Jane stood by the window, rubbing a circle of condensation away from the glass. The air outside was thick with driving snow. It was a whiteout. A man could get lost 10 feet from his own front door in a storm like this. She went to the stove and fed it more wood. She filled a large iron kettle with water and set it to boil. Then she waited. 1 hour passed, then 2. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her, broken only by the howling wind. A familiar creeping panic began to gnaw at her stomach. The panic of being helpless. The panic of relying on someone else. If Gideon died out there, she would die in here. It was a simple, brutal mathematics. By 4 o'clock, the light was failing. Jane paced the floor, her hands twisting in her apron. Suddenly, the heavy door shuddered. A desperate, heavy pounding echoed over the wind. Jane scrambled to the door and threw the latch. The wind blasted into the room, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air. Gideon collapsed through the frame, bringing a mountain of white with him. He hit the floor hard on his knees. He was coated in ice. His beard was frozen solid, and his eyes were barely slits against the cold. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Jane didn't panic. The city had taught her how to handle a crisis. She grabbed his arms and hauled him inward, kicking the door shut with her heel to seal out the storm. "Gideon," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Get up. You have to get closer to the stove." He groaned, struggling to get his legs under him. He was shivering so violently his teeth clattered. Jane put her shoulder under his armpit, bearing his massive weight, and dragged him toward the radiating heat of the iron stove. She pushed him down onto the floor rug. "Don't move," she ordered. She went to work. She yanked his heavy ice-caked leather mittens off. His fingers were bone-white and stiff. She unbuttoned his buffalo coat, struggling with the frozen toggles. Underneath, his wool shirt was soaked through with melted snow and sweat. "Got turned around." Gideon forced the words out, his jaw trembling. "Gully, filled with drift." "Stop talking. Save your strength." Jane pulled off his boots. His feet were cold, but not white. That was good. She grabbed a dry blanket from the bed and wrapped it tightly around his shoulders. Then she poured a mug of hot water from the kettle, adding a generous splash of whiskey from the bottle he kept on the high shelf. She knelt beside him. His hands were shaking too badly to hold the mug. Jane didn't hesitate. She cupped his hands with hers, guiding the tin mug to his lips. "Drink." Slow. Gideon drank. The hot liquid hit his stomach, and a long, ragged sigh escaped his nose. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wood box. For the first time, Jane was close enough to truly look at his face. Not just a passing glance, but a prolonged, intimate study. The scars were a map of violence. The fire had taken the outer edge of his eyebrow and melted the skin of his cheekbone into a smooth, taut landscape of pink and white. It pulled at his ear. It was a devastating injury, but she also saw the rest of him. The strong, square line of his uninjured jaw, the thick, dark eyelashes, the deep lines of exhaustion around his mouth. He opened his eyes. They were inches apart. He saw her looking. The familiar flinch passed over his features, that instinct to turn the ruined side of his face away into the shadows. He started to pull back. Jane's hand snapped out. She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," she said softly. Gideon froze. He looked at her, his breath catching in his chest. "I'm hideous, Jane. You don't have to pretend. I survived working 12-hour shifts in a Chicago textile mill where half the girls lost fingers to the looms." Jane said, her voice low and steady. "I was married to a man who drank his wages and used his fists to make sure I didn't complain. He had a perfectly handsome face, Gideon. He was a monster." She released his wrist and gently pushed the mug back to his lips. "A scar is just a place where the skin healed," she said, looking directly into his good eye. "I prefer a man whose scars are on the outside." Gideon stared at her. The howling of the storm outside seemed to fade into a dull roar. He swallowed the last of the whiskey. The violent shivering was beginning to subside, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. "You're a hard woman, Jane O'Reilly," he murmured, his voice thick. "I had to be," she replied, pulling the blanket tighter around his neck. "Otherwise I wouldn't have survived long enough to make it to this mountain." She stood up, picking up the empty mug. "I'll fetch you some stew. Stay by the fire." As she walked away, Gideon watched her. The tight, cynical armor he had worn since the accident, the armor that told him he was unlovable, destined to die alone in the cold, showed its very first microscopic crack. The snow did not leave the mountain quietly. It surrendered in a long, agonizing month of grey slush and endless drumming rain. The eaves of the cabin dripped a maddening rhythm. The ground turned into a thick, sucking soup that tried to steal a man's boots with every step. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence of winter had shifted. It was no longer the tense quiet of strangers avoiding each other. It had become a shared, comfortable stillness. Gideon still slept on the floor. Jane still kept the hearth. But the lines between their lives had begun to blur. He showed her how to skin a marten without ruining the pelt. She learned to trim his hair, her scissors working carefully around the scarred, sensitive skin of his scalp, her touch light and devoid of hesitation. He didn't flinch anymore when she was near him. Late one April afternoon, Gideon walked into the cabin carrying a Winchester .73. It was heavy with gun oil and use. He laid it on the table next to the dough Jane was kneading. "Flour's running low," Gideon said. He pulled a rag from his pocket and began wiping down the barrel. "We need to go down to Pinedale next week. The pass is finally clear of the deep drifts." Jane stopped kneading. A small puff of flour settled on the rough wood. She stared at the rifle. "Why is that on my table?" "Because if I'm under the wagon fixing a busted axle and a hungry cougar comes out of the brush, I need to know you won't just stand there holding a rolling pin." He picked up the weapon and held it out to her by the stock. Jane wiped her hands on her apron. She took it. It was shockingly heavy, the steel cold against her palms. "Lever action," Gideon said, stepping behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the massive radiating heat of him. "Thumb here. Pull down hard. It loads around. Don't touch the trigger until you want something to die." Jane cycled the action. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the small room. "Put it to your shoulder. Tight," he instructed. "If you hold it loose, the recoil will break your collarbone." She tucked the stock into her shoulder and sighted down the barrel toward the window. "Good," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "We'll shoot a few rounds at a stump tomorrow, just so you know the sound." 3 days later, they hitched the wagon and drove down the mountain. The descent was treacherous, the wheels sliding deep into rutted tracks. By the time they reached the valley floor, the horses were lathered and the buckboard was caked in thick grey mud. Pinedale had changed since November. The spring thaw had brought a surge of transient miners, timber cutters and drifters looking for a quick dollar after a long winter. The main street was loud, crowded, and smelled of stale beer and wet livestock. Jane sat rigid on the wagon bench as Gideon steered toward the mercantile. The townspeople stopped and stared just as they had the day she arrived, but the nature of the stares had shifted. Before they looked at her like a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. Now they looked at her with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. She was still alive. She hadn't run. Gideon tied off the horses. He helped her down, his hand wrapping firmly around her forearm. "Get the flour, coffee, and salt," Gideon said, pressing a small leather coin purse into her hand. "I'll go to the assayer and trade the pelts. Meet me back here in an hour." Jane nodded and turned toward the mercantile. Gideon watched her go. He liked the confident set of her shoulders. He liked that she didn't shrink under the eyes of the town. He took the bundle of trapped pelts and headed across the muddy street. As he passed the open doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a voice drifted out over the tinny piano music. "I'm telling you she's tall, dark hair, sharp eyes, probably looking miserable." Gideon slowed his pace. He stopped beside a rain barrel just outside the saloon doors, adjusting his hat to cover his scarred profile. Inside Hiram, the livery owner, was leaning against the bar, a whiskey in his hand. Standing next to him was a stranger. The man didn't belong in Pinedale. He wore a heavy wool suit that was tailored for a city, though it was currently splattered with trail mud. He had a bowler hat pushed back on his head and a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest. His eyes were small, dark, and restless. "Lot of women pass through, mister," Hiram said, taking a sip. "What's this one to you?" "She's a thief," the stranger said smoothly. He had a nasal, flat accent. Chicago, maybe. Or somewhere back east. "Name's Jane Miller. Stole a considerable sum of money from her husband's business partners before fleeing west. I've been tracking her since St. Louis. I know she bought a ticket for this territory." Gideon felt a cold knot form in his gut. Jane Miller. She had never told him her last name. Just Jane. "Well," Hiram chuckled, a cruel, familiar sound. "We ain't got a Jane Miller, but we do got a Jane. Blew into town late last fall. Mail order bride." The stranger's eyes snapped to Hiram. "A bride? To who?" Hiram grinned, showing rotten teeth. "To a monster. Fella named Gideon Croft. Lives way up on Cutter's Ridge. Ain't nobody goes up there. Man's half grizzly and crazy as a shithouse rat." The stranger reached into his coat and tossed a silver dollar onto the bar. "Cutter's Ridge. Much obliged." Gideon didn't wait to hear more. He turned and walked swiftly toward the mercantile, his boots splashing heavily through the muck. The anger wasn't hot. It was a slow, creeping freeze in his veins. He found Jane at the counter negotiating the price of a sack of coffee beans with the clerk. She looked up and saw his face. Her argument died in her throat. "Leave it," Gideon said. "But the flour—" "Leave it, Jane. We're going." She saw the hard, unyielding set of his unscarred jaw and the dangerous glint in his blue eye. She didn't ask questions. She turned and walked out of the store with him. They climbed into the wagon. Gideon whipped the reins, and the horses surged forward, tearing the wheels from the mud. They left Pinedale at a dangerous trot, the wagon bouncing violently over the ruts. They didn't speak until they were an hour up the trail, swallowed by the dense, towering pines. The town was far behind them, but the shadow of it was clinging to the wagon. "Who is he?" Gideon asked, staring straight ahead at the road. Jane flinched. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, staring at her dirt-stained boots. The silence stretched until the only sound was the creak of the leather harness and the heavy breathing of the horses. "His name is Cole," Jane whispered. Her voice was brittle, devoid of its usual strength. "He's a Pinkerton, or a bounty hunter, or worse. The men my husband ran with didn't care much for official titles." The wagon ground its way up the mountain. The air grew thinner and colder, biting through the damp wool of their coats. Gideon didn't yell. He didn't demand the truth. He just kept driving, his massive hands holding the reins with a casual, terrifying strength. "My husband's name was Thomas Miller," Jane said. The words spilled out like blood from a deep cut, frantic and messy. He was a foreman at the rail yards in Chicago, but that was a front. He ran a crew that skimmed cargo, whiskey payrolls guns. He was a vicious, cruel man, Gideon. When he drank, he liked to use his fists to remind me who owned the house. She reached up and unconsciously touched her left cheekbone. Gideon caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. One night a payroll job went bad. Jane continued, her voice trembling. Thomas came home covered in blood. Not his own. He was panicked. He shoved a steel lockbox under the floorboards and told me to pack a bag. He said we had to run, but he needed to go silence a witness first. She turned her head to look at Gideon's profile. He never came back. The police found him in an alley the next morning with his throat cut. His partners did it. They knew he was going to bolt. Jane swallowed hard. I knew they would come for the house. They would come for the money. And they wouldn't leave a loose end like me breathing. So you took the box, Gideon stated. It wasn't a question. I took a crowbar to the floorboards, Jane said fiercely, the fear in her voice momentarily eclipsed by defiance. I broke the lock. There was $1,200 inside. Blood money. I took it, I packed my carpet bag, and I ran to the train station. I bought the furthest ticket I could afford under a fake name, and I answered an ad in a matrimonial paper for a man living at the edge of civilization. The cabin came into view through the trees, a dark square of safety against the harsh grey landscape. And the money? Gideon asked, pulling back on the reins to halt the horses. It's in a tin beneath the flour barrel, she said. She looked at him, her grey eyes wide and pleading. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door, Gideon. I swear to God, I just wanted to live. Gideon set the brake. He turned to look at her fully. The scarred side of his face caught the fading afternoon light. It looked brutal, unforgiving. Jane braced herself. She waited for him to tell her to pack her bag. She waited for him to demand the money to throw her back into the wagon and drive her down to Pinedale to hand her over to Cole. It was what any sensible man would do. Instead, Gideon climbed down from the wagon. He walked around to her side and reached up, wrapping his hands around her waist. He lifted her down into the mud, his grip firm and steady. Get inside, Gideon said. Bar the door. Jane grabbed his sleeve. Gideon, you can't fight him. He won't just be alone. He'll hire muscle from the saloons. You owe me nothing. Gideon looked down at her hand, gripping his coat. Then he looked at her face. You're my wife, Gideon said. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and absolute. He had never said them out loud before. This is my mountain, and a man doesn't get to step on my property and threaten what's mine. Go inside, Jane. She let go of his sleeve and ran for the cabin. Gideon went to work. The slow, methodical trapper vanished, replaced by something much older and far more dangerous. He unhitched the horses and led them not into the lean-to, but deep into a thicket of spruce 50 yards behind the cabin, tying them off where they wouldn't be seen or hit by stray lead. He walked the perimeter of the clearing. He checked the sight lines from the tree line to the front door. He dug into his tool shed, pulling out a coil of heavy trapping wire and a half-dozen bear traps. He didn't set the traps in the open. He set them in the blind spots, the places a man would naturally step to find cover behind a stump or a low boulder. He covered them lightly with dead pine needles and mud. When the sun finally dipped below, the jagged peaks plunging the mountain into deep purple twilight, Gideon walked into the cabin. Jane was sitting at the table. The Winchester 73 was in front of her. The lamp was unlit. The only light came from the glowing grate of the iron stove. Gideon walked to the corner and pulled down his own rifle, a heavy, large-caliber Sharps buffalo gun. He loaded a cartridge as big as a man's thumb and snapped the breech shut. They won't come up the main trail, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They'll leave their horses down in the ravine and hike up through the timber to flank us. Cole is a city dog, but if he hired local trash, they'll know how to stalk. He pulled a chair into the darkest corner of the room, near the window, but out of the direct line of sight. He sat down and rested the heavy barrel of the Sharps on the sill. What do I do? Jane asked, her hands gripping the stock of the Winchester. You stay on the floor behind the stove, Gideon said. Thickest iron in the house. It'll stop a bullet. If anyone comes through that door, you aim for the center of their chest and you pull the lever until the gun clicks empty. Jane slid off her chair and crouched behind the cast-iron belly of the stove. The heat radiated against her back. Silence descended on the cabin. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet. Outside, an owl hooted. The wind rustled the upper branches of the pines. They waited for 2 hours. Jane's legs cramped, but she didn't move. She watched Gideon. He sat like a stone statue, completely unmoving, his good eye locked on the tree line outside the window. Then it happened. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sharp, metallic snap of heavy steel jaws slamming shut, followed instantly by a scream that tore through the quiet night. There's the local trash, Gideon muttered. The scream echoed high and frantic from the brush to the left of the cabin. Shoot the damn door! A voice yelled from the tree line. It was Cole. His nasal city accent was unmistakable, even laced with panic. Gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening. Muzzle flashes strobed brightly from the dark edge of the woods. Lead tore into the cabin. A bullet punched through the window, shattering the glass and spraying shards across the floor. Another hit the door frame, sending a shower of heavy oak splinters into the room. Jane squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, curling tighter behind the stove. The noise was a physical weight beating against her skull. Gideon didn't flinch. He tracked the largest muzzle flash, settled the heavy stock of the sharps against his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared like a cannon. The recoil rocked Gideon back, a cloud of thick white smoke filling the corner of the cabin. A heavy thud sounded from the woods, followed by a wet, choking gasp. 1, Gideon said calmly. He cracked the breech, the brass casing ejecting with a metallic clink, and shoved another massive round into the chamber. Rush him! Cole screamed from the dark. He's only got 1 shot at a time. Heavy boots pounded against the muddy ground, charging across the clearing. Jane! Gideon barked. The window. Keep them off the porch. Jane didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her in Chicago shattered, replaced by a cold, desperate survival instinct. She crawled out from behind the stove, sweeping broken glass out of the way with her forearm, and raised the Winchester to the shattered window. A shadow was sprinting towards the front door, a man with a pistol raised. Jane leveled the barrel. Thumb here. Pull down hard. She cranked the lever. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked like a mule, slamming painfully into her shoulder, but she held on. The shadow stumbled, dropping the pistol, and fell hard into the mud, clutching his thigh and screaming. Gideon fired the sharps again. Another man went down in the brush. Suddenly the front door shuddered violently. Someone had reached the porch from the blind side. Heavy boots kicked at the heavy oak. The iron latch groaned. Get back! Gideon yelled, dropping the empty sharps and lunging toward his heavy leather belt hanging on the peg. He drew a Colt revolver just as the heavy wooden door splintered and gave way. Cole burst into the room. He didn't look like a slick city man anymore. He was covered in mud, his eyes wide and wild. He held a double-barreled shotgun, sweeping it toward Gideon. Gideon fired the Colt. The bullet grazed Cole's ribs, spinning him sideways, but it didn't stop him. Cole pulled the trigger on the shotgun. The blast tore through the cabin. Gideon threw himself to the side, but the edge of the buckshot spread caught him. He hit the floor hard, a heavy, breathless grunt escaping his chest. Blood bloomed instantly across the left shoulder of his wool shirt. Jane screamed. Cole racked the shotgun, dropping the spent shell, and leveled it at Gideon's head as the mountain man struggled to rise. Where's the money, you freak? Cole spat, panting heavily. Jane was on her knees near the window. The Winchester was in her hands. She pumped the lever sighted squarely on Cole's back and pulled the trigger. Click. It had jammed. The action was stuck halfway. Cole spun around at the sound. He saw Jane kneeling in the glass. A cruel smile stretched across his face. There you are, you little thief. He swung the shotgun barrel toward her. Jane didn't freeze. With a furious yell, she grabbed the heavy Winchester by the barrel, leaped up and swung the heavy wooden stock like a baseball bat. The heavy wood connected squarely with Cole's jaw. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Cole's eyes rolled back, his finger spasming on the trigger. The shotgun fired into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of dust and moss as Cole collapsed in a heap on the floorboards. Jane stood over him, chest heaving, the jammed rifle still clutched in her hands. She was trembling violently, staring at the motionless body. "Jane!" The voice was weak. She dropped the rifle and spun around. Gideon was sitting up against the wall, his right hand gripping his left shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dark and thick in the dim light. "Gideon!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering, terrified to touch the wound. "Oh God, you're bleeding! You're bleeding badly!" "I've survived worse." He ground out through clenched teeth. His face was pale, the scars on his left side standing out starkly against his ashen skin. "Is he dead?" Jane glanced back at Cole. The man was groaning, blood pooling under his cheek. "No, just broken. Good." Gideon forced himself up onto one knee, leaning heavily against the wall. "Tie him up with the trapping wire, tightly. When the sun comes up, I'm throwing him over a horse and taking him to the marshal in Pinedale. I'll tell him he tried to rob a homestead. They hang thieves in this territory." "Gideon, stop talking, you need a bandage." "Do it, Jane." He commanded, his voice finding its heavy rumble again. "Before he wakes up." Jane moved. She found the wire dragged Cole's arms behind his back and bound him so tight his hands began to turn blue. She didn't care. When she was finished, she turned back to Gideon. He had managed to pull himself onto a chair at the table. He was panting, his chin resting on his chest. Jane found a clean flour sack, ripped it into strips, and went to work. She unbuttoned his shirt, peeling the blood-soaked wool back. The buckshot had torn through the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone, but making a messy, bleeding ruin of his flesh. She poured whiskey over the wound. Gideon flinched violently, a low animal growl escaping his throat, but he didn't pull away. She packed the wound and bound it tightly with the cloth, her hands steady, her movements efficient. When she finished, she tied the knot and sat back on her heels. The adrenaline was leaving her system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She looked up at him. Gideon was looking down at her. His pale blue eye was wide, searching her face. There was no cynicism left in his gaze. There was no weary resignation. There was only awe. "You didn't run," Gideon whispered. "I told you," Jane said, reaching up to gently wipe a smear of soot and blood from his uninjured cheek. "I'm tired of running." Gideon leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. He let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in 5 years, the mountain man didn't feel the biting cold of isolation. He just felt the warmth of the woman kneeling in front of him. "You take the bed tonight," Jane said softly, her hands resting on his uninjured arm. "You need to elevate that shoulder." Gideon closed his eyes. "Only if you're in it with me, Jane." Jane didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." Dawn did not break over the mountain so much as it bled through the grey overcast. The wind had died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Inside the ruined cabin, the air was thick with the sharp acidic sting of burnt powder and the copper stench of blood. Jane sat in the straight-backed wooden chair, her hands resting on her knees. Her knuckles were bruised purple. She stared blankly at the shattered window. Gideon was asleep in the bed. Or passed out. Jane couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. The fever had set in just past 3 a.m, turning his pale skin a dangerous flushed red. The flour sack bandage around his shoulder was soaked through a dark, stiff crust. In the corner, Cole lay hog-tied. He was awake, his eyes darting frantically around the room, tracking Jane's every shallow breath. His broken jaw had swelled to the size of a bruised grapefruit, turning the lower half of his face into a grotesque, purple mass. He tried to mumble something, the sound muffled by his own swollen tongue. "Shut up," Jane said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at him. She just spoke the words to the floorboards. Cole whimpered and went still. Jane forced herself to stand. Her bones felt like lead, her muscles screaming in protest. She walked to the bed and pressed the back of her cold hand against Gideon's forehead. He was burning up. If she left him here, infection would take him before the sun set. She turned and walked out the splintered front door. The cold morning air hit her like a slap, clearing the haze from her head. She had work to do. The mud of the clearing was churned and red. The man Gideon had shot with the sharps lay face down in a patch of scrub oak. The second man, the one who had charged the porch, was curled around his shattered thigh, dead from shock and blood loss. The third man, the one in the bear trap, was gone, leaving behind a gruesome trail of dragged blood, heading down the ravine. He wouldn't make it far. Jane didn't feel pity. She felt a profound, exhausted emptiness. These men had come to steal her life, and they had paid the toll. She marched to the spruce thicket, found the hidden horses, and led them back to the wagon. Her fingers were clumsy, numb with cold, as she wrestled the heavy leather harnesses over the animals. It took her 3 tries to secure the buckles, cursing under her breath, tearing a fingernail to the quick. She sucked the blood from her thumb and kept working. Once the team was hitched, she went back inside. "Get up," she said, kicking Cole's boot. He groaned, struggling against the thick trapping wire. Jane didn't help him. She grabbed him by the collar of his ruined city coat and dragged him across the floorboards. He screamed through his wired-shut teeth as splinters tore into his legs. She hauled him to the edge of the porch, pushed him over the lip, and let him drop face first into the mud. Then she went for Gideon. He was a mountain of a man, and the fever made him dead weight. Jane hooked her arms under his good shoulder and hauled backward. Gideon woke with a choked gasp, his pale blue eye rolling wildly. "Jane," he grunted, his boots dragging on the floor. "I've got you." She lied, her boots slipping in the debris. "Lean on me. We have to go." It took them 20 minutes to cross the 20 feet to the wagon. Gideon nearly collapsed twice, his blood leaving bright, terrible spots on the frozen mud. Jane pushed him up onto the buckboard, her shoulders screaming under his weight until he tumbled backward into the wagon bed. She threw a heavy canvas tarp over him to keep the frost off his skin. She walked over to Cole, grabbed him by the scruff, and heaved him into the back, dropping him unceremoniously near Gideon's boots. Jane climbed onto the driver's bench. She laid the Winchester 73 across her lap, picked up the thick leather reins, and snapped them hard over the horse's rumps. "Move!" she rasped. The descent was a slow, rattling torture. The wagon slammed into deep ruts, sending violent tremors through the wooden frame. Every jolt elicited a low, agonizing groan from the back. Jane didn't look back. She kept her eyes locked on the treacherous, winding trail, her hands gripping the reins so tightly her palms began to bleed. The cynic in her whispered that it was over, that she was driving a dying man and a prisoner down a mountain just to be hanged for murder when they reached the bottom. She silenced the voice. She wasn't the terrified woman in Chicago anymore. She was a woman who owned a Winchester, a piece of a mountain, and a man who had taken a bullet for her. She was bringing hell down to Pinedale. It was past noon when the wagon rolled into the muddy main drag of Pinedale. The town was alive with the midday rush miners carrying picks, merchants sweeping boardwalks, women carrying baskets. The noise stopped the moment the wagon appeared. The horses were lathered in white sweat, their heads hanging low. The wagon was coated in thick mountain mud, and on the bench sat Jane, her dress stiff with dried blood, her face pale and sharp as cut glass, a rifle resting casually over her knees. Men stepped off the road. Women pulled their children back onto the boardwalk. Hiram, the livery owner, froze with a bucket of oats in his hands. Jane didn't acknowledge them. She drove the rig straight through the center of town, stopping in front of the small square building that bore the wooden sign U.S. Marshal. She pulled the heavy iron brake lever and wrapped the reins around the post. She stood up on the bench, ignoring the pain in her back, and looked at the crowd gathering in a loose, cautious circle. The door to the office opened. Marshal Boone stepped out. He was an older man with a grey mustache stained yellow by tobacco, wearing a dusty black suit and a silver star pinned to his vest. He rested his hand casually on the butt of his Colt. "Ma'am," Boone said, his voice carrying easily over the quiet street. "You look like you've had a rough morning. I have a man bleeding to death in the back of this wagon." Jane said, her voice clear, hard, and devoid of tremor. "I need the doctor. Right now." Boone stepped off the porch and walked to the back of the wagon. He looked in. He saw Gideon pale and shivering under the canvas, the blood-soaked bandages stark against his skin. Then he saw Cole hog-tied and beaten, unrecognizable. "Doc Stanton!" Boone bellowed over his shoulder without taking his eyes off the wagon. "Get your bag out here." Boone looked back at Jane. "Who's the package wrapped in wire?" He said his name was Cole. Jane replied, climbing down from the bench. "She didn't let go of the rifle. He brought 3 men up to Cutter's Ridge last night. They kicked in our door and put buckshot into my husband. They aimed to kill us and rob our home." The crowd murmured. 3 men?" Boone asked, his eyes narrowing. "Where are they?" "2 are dead in the mud in front of my porch," Jane said flatly. "The 3rd caught his leg in a bear trap and crawled off into the brush. He'll be dead by nightfall if the wolves don't find him first." Boone stared at her. He looked at her blood-stained hands, the brutal set of her jaw, and the unwavering stare of her grey eyes. He slowly removed his hat. "I'll send a posse up to collect the bodies," Boone said. He gestured to 2 men in the crowd. "Help Doc carry Gideon over to the clinic. Careful with him." As the men rushed forward to lift Gideon, Cole began to writhe in the mud of the wagon bed. He forced a sound through his swollen, broken mouth. It sounded like, "Thief. She's a thief." Boone looked down at Cole, then back up at Jane. He got something to say. Jane didn't blink. "He was a bounty hunter hired by outlaws back in Chicago. My first husband ran with a bad crowd. When he was murdered, I took what I needed to survive and fled west. This man tracked me hired local thugs and tried to murder us in our sleep for the money." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "The money is mine, Marshal. My husband bled for it. Gideon bled for it. You can lock me up for stealing from dead thieves, but you'll have to pry this rifle from my cold hands to do it." The street was dead silent. Boone spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud near Cole's head. He looked at the bound man, then at the rifle in Jane's hands, and finally toward the clinic where Gideon had just been carried. "I don't hold jurisdiction in Chicago, Mrs. Croft," Boone said smoothly, putting his hat back on his head. "And I don't rightly care what a dead man's widow takes out of a dead man's floorboards. What I care about is armed men shooting up homesteads in my territory." He reached down, grabbed Cole by the back of his belt, and hoisted him out of the wagon with a grunt, letting the man drop into the muck of the street. "I'll lock this one up. He'll hang before the month is out for attempted murder," Boone said. "You go be with your husband." Jane didn't thank him. She didn't nod. She turned on her heel and walked through the mud toward the clinic, her spine stiff, the rifle still in her hand. Inside the small, sterile-smelling room, Doc Stanton was cutting away Gideon's ruined shirt. Jane stood in the corner. Stanton was a nervous, bird-like man. When he peeled away the fabric and saw the hideous, melted scars that covered the left side of Gideon's chest and neck, he hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. Jane stepped forward. She placed the butt of the Winchester on the wooden floor with a heavy, authoritative thud. "Don't you look at him like that!" Jane snarled, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You treat him like he's the finest man in this county, because he is. Now dig that lead out." Stanton swallowed hard, nodded, and reached for his forceps. Jane pulled a chair to the head of the table. She sat down, took Gideon's massive, uninjured right hand in her 2 small, bruised ones, and held on tight. Gideon turned his head slightly. His pale eye found hers through the haze of fever and pain. "I told you." He rasped, a ghost of a smile touching the unscarred corner of his mouth. "They hang thieves in this territory." "Shut up, Gideon," she whispered, kissing his knuckles. "Save your strength." The mountain healed slowly, but it healed. Late May brought the great thaw. The grey slush retreated, leaving behind sprawling carpets of vibrant green alpine grass and violent bursts of purple lupine. The air lost its bite, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of pine resin baking in the afternoon sun. The cabin looked different now. The shattered window had been replaced with thick, new glass brought up from town. The front door was no longer a simple oak slab. It was a massive reinforced barrier constructed of raw timber and cross-braced with iron, bolted onto heavy steel hinges. Gideon had built it with one arm in a sling. He was out in the clearing now, working the chopping block. The heavy thud of the axe echoed off the canyon walls. He swung with his right arm, his left shoulder still tight and pulling with fresh, jagged scar tissue. He was shirtless in the warm sun. The vast, ruined landscape of burn scars on his left side was fully exposed to the daylight, stark against the heavy muscle of his chest and back. Jane stood on the porch, wiping her hands on a clean apron. She held a tin mug of coffee. She watched him work. She didn't see a monster anymore. She didn't even see the scars. She just saw Gideon. She saw the man who checked the perimeter every night before he slept. She saw the man who had traded the remaining blood money in the tin box, not for whiskey or guns, but for a sturdy milk cow, a plough blade, and a bolt of fine blue wool for her to make a new dress. She saw a man who had built an iron fortress around her. Gideon buried the axe head into the stump and stopped breathing heavily. Sweat gleamed on his skin. He turned and saw her watching. He didn't instinctively turn his left side away. That habit had died in the clinic in Pinedale. He grabbed a rag from the woodpile, wiped his neck, and walked toward the porch. "You're going to tear those stitches if you keep swinging like that." Jane scolded lightly, handing him the mug of coffee. Gideon took it, his fingers brushing hers. "Wood needs chopping, Jane. Winter always comes back." "Let it come," she said. She leaned against the sturdy new doorframe, crossing her arms. "We have enough flour to last till spring. The ledger is balanced, and there isn't a man within 100 miles who'd be stupid enough to hike up Cutter's Ridge looking for trouble." Gideon drank the coffee, looking out over the valley. The view was staggering, a vast, endless sea of green peaks rolling out towards the horizon under an impossibly blue sky. "Town's quiet," Gideon muttered. "Marshal Boone sent word up with the freight driver yesterday. Cole hung last Tuesday, snapped his neck clean." Jane felt a slight shiver, not of fear, but of profound closure. The shadow of Thomas Miller and the brutal streets of Chicago had finally been severed left, dangling at the end of a rope in a dirty mining town. "Good," she said simply. Gideon set the mug on the railing. He stepped closer to her. He reached out with his uninjured hand and gently traced the line of her jaw. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the calloused roughness of his skin. "I never asked you," Gideon said, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly rumble that made her chest tight. "Back in town, when you told Boone you were my wife." "What about it?" Jane asked, looking up into his pale blue eye. "Did you mean it?" he asked. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, stripping away the hardened exterior of the mountain man. He wasn't asking out of obligation. He was asking because he'd terrified of the answer. Or was it just for the marshal? Jane didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for lightness. This was the foundation of their life. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against the ruined, melted skin of his left cheek. Gideon's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch. "I am a practical woman, Gideon Croft," Jane said softly, her thumb brushing near his eye. "I came up this mountain looking for a roof and a stove. I found a man who stood between me and a bullet. I found a man who sleeps on the floor to make me feel safe. I meant every word I said to the Marshal, and I mean every word I say to you now." She stepped off the porch and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the warm, scarred expanse of his chest. Gideon hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his massive arms came around her, pulling her tight against him. He buried his face in her dark hair, breathing in the scent of lye, soap, and wood smoke. For a man who had spent 5 years believing he was a repulsive creature, destined to freeze alone in the high country, the warmth of the woman in his arms felt like a physical salvation. "You're my wife," Gideon whispered into her hair, sealing the vow. "And you're my husband," Jane replied, holding him tighter. They stood there in the mud, and the wildflowers, 2 battered, cynical survivors who had dragged themselves to the edge of the world. They hadn't found a fairy tale. They had found something much harder to break. They had found each other. The winter ice has finally broken, but the fire forged between Gideon and Jane will burn long into the years to come. 2 castaways bruised by the harsh world built an iron fortress out of nothing but hard truths and gunpowder. They proved survival isn't just about breathing. It is finding the one person who will stand shoulder to shoulder with you in the dark. Thank you for listening to this very gritty frontier tale. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our video channel for more thrilling Wild West storytelling.